Um, Welcome everybody uh, to this latest one of the webinar series that the Center for Development Economics and Sustainability at Monash University is running. And this one is Will Free Trade Survive COVID-19? And this is part of the series on COVID-19 and beyond. I want to first of all welcome everybody, the audience, and particularly our distinguished panel for being with us today. And the topic is certainly one of the most important issues arising in the aftermath of COVID-19, particularly because it seems like a whole historical era seems to be coming to an end. There was the 1930s depression, followed by the Second World War, and then the world was reconstructed in a way based on the principles of free trade, which enabled 6 decades of unprecedented economic growth and prosperity around the world. So at the heart of this economic growth in the post-war period was the vision of global free trade, which was articulated really even before the war ended at Bretton Woods in 1944, and they set up the organizations and institutions like the predecessor of the World Trade Organization, GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the IMF and the World Bank, and so on. And even though there was a whole period where a lot of countries, the Soviet Union, China, the whole Soviet bloc, and countries like India and many other developing countries all tried to go it alone, develop in isolation from the global economy. Experience showed that that was not the way to sustain economic growth. And from the 1990s, we have had this incredible surge in the integration of the global economy. And for a time, it seemed like the specter of protectionism, of inward-looking policies, of beggar thy neighbor policies, where countries thought that one could grow at the expense of each other rather than together, that these ideas, which dominated thinking and politics in the 1930s, were dead and buried. But things started to change after the global financial crisis. We could begin to see the emergence of more protectionist type tendencies in many countries, but most of all in the United States, which had led the push for global free trade and open barriers, open markets at the end of the Second World War. Now, when we had the COVID-19, one would have normally expected that this is a global disaster, a catastrophe which requires global coordination and cooperation, and this would actually serve to bring the world together. But instead, what we have seen is a huge upsurge in the kinds of economic thinking and the kind of politics that were associated with it during the 1930s. It hasn't quite got to the 1930s yet, but the signs are not great. And this is happening in the context of living in a world which has never been as integrated as now. And our panelists will outline the extent of global integration, the emergence of global value chains which have united the production processes of the world in a way that has never happened in human history before. And then comes the economics and politics of erecting barriers and going back to a period that we don't want to really go back to, tit for tat reactions, beggar thy neighbor policies, ending up trade wars, as many people have pointed out, have a tendency to spiral out of control into not just trade wars, but wars with arms. And that's what happened in the 1930s. And it's in that kind of backdrop that we are holding this webinar. And I will introduce the panelists first. We have three very distinguished panelists. Craig Emerson. Craig Emerson is an Australian economist, started off being an academic, then went to public policy, was advisor to Bob Hawke in the 1980s in Australia, when huge reforms were undertaken in Australia to open up the Australian economy, which had been very inward-looking, which had been shackled by so many trade barriers in the preceding period. And since then, Craig has had several ministerial positions and has been continuously in the public policy arena, and is very well equipped to talk about the kinds of issues that Australia in particular, but the world overall is facing now. And for Australia, I would expect that Craig would also touch on the dangers that loom in the horizon, because the specter of trade war between US and China in this part of the world, it's also emerging particularly sharply in the last week or so between EU, the European Union, and the US as well, with this conflict over taxation of tech companies. And for Australia, the conflict between US and China creates pressures that have been unprecedented in recent times, because Australia is a political and military ally of the US and has been ever since the Second World War. But China is the most important trading partner by far. US is a trading partner, but it is, I think, number 3 at the moment. And it is a country with which Australia runs a trade deficit rather than a trade surplus, as it does with China. So it creates enormous pressures here. And Dr. Aaditya Mattoo. Aaditya is from the World Bank. He's the chief economist of the East Asia and Pacific region of the World Bank. He's a trade specialist with background in trade policy analysis globally for a long period of time. And then we have Mikic from the United Nations, SCAP in Bangkok, who is, and she's the director of trade investment and innovation in UNSCAP. And she has also been, she's a trade economist and has decades of work both in academia and in policy in the United Nations. So we have a very distinguished panel, and the way that we hope to run the webinar is I will start off first with Aaditya, followed by Mia, and then give the floor to Craig. And then it'll be open for Q&A. When you have questions, please send them through the Q&A function, and we'll collate them and present them to the panel at the end of the presentations so that they can react. My pleasure to ask Aaditya to start his presentation. Aaditya.
Thank you, Cicera. Thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me well and clearly? Yeah. As you said, Cicera, after 2 decades of hyper-globalization, which saw remarkable growth in trade and in incomes, and led to the dramatic reduction in poverty all over the world from levels of more than 30% to less than 10%, we are today witnessing a third major shock to trade. The first big shock, of course, was the Great Recession, which ushered in a period of what we can think of as a great flattening. Trade as a share of GDP stopped growing, and global value chains as a share of overall trade stopped expanding. Then came this period of trade tensions, which you referred to, and that created a broader climate of uncertainty, which inhibited both investment and trade. And finally, we see this perhaps the worst of all possible shocks, COVID-19, which is disrupting production, disrupting demand, and disrupting transport. And I will not talk much about the damage that it's doing today, but focus more on what it might mean for the future. And the central point I would like to make is that disruption today need not spell contraction tomorrow. Instead, I expect COVID-19 to accelerate 3 pre-existing trends. The first is a shift away from China of manufacturing due to a phenomenon that I refer to based on recent research that we have done looking at past shocks as a kind of dependence aversion. The second is an increasing globalization of certain services due to the investments which are sunk in digitization. And these two, I will argue, are creating new opportunities for developing countries at different stages of development. But there is a third pre-existing trend, which again you referred to, Cicera, which is protectionism. And I will argue that because of the increased inequality, the increased insecurity, created in part by the kind of trade restrictions that have been taken in response to COVID, and the deepening of the international rivalry between the United States and China, that trend is also likely to grow stronger and accelerate. So the important question is, how far are countries going to be able to implement deeper domestic reform to take advantage of these first two trends, and how far are we able to work together to counter the third threat? As we know, COVID-19 has hit economies which are crucial nodes in the global production network. As early as March, we saw 17 countries which accounted for as much as 70% of world trade being affected. this contagion is becoming mutually reinforcing through both demand and supply channels. We turned to the past and looked at one of the most significant shocks that came to the global economy, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, to try and ask a question that everybody is asking. When, if ever, COVID-19 is contained, how do we expect the trade to behave? How far are we likely to see durable changes in the pattern of trade? And in particular, one phrase that has become popular and recurrent is the idea of giving up efficiency to secure greater resilience, especially in global value chains where the current disruption has supposedly created a greater craving for self-sufficiency. Now, even though that shock, the earthquake in Japan, is very different, I will argue that we have some interesting lessons to draw from it. Now, the first striking thing is that there was no tendency for imports to decline. If you see in these charts around 2011, if anything, there was a growing spurt in demand, both in areas of high dependence on Japan and low dependence on Japan. So no evidence of increased sense of risk and uncertainty leading to reshoring. Instead, what you see is that where there was high dependence on Japan, there was a switch away from Japan as a source. Not so much where dependence on Japan was relatively low. Interestingly, even though I don't show that here, there was no real trend towards diversification. Measures of diversification like the Herfindahl index don't show that there was any tendency to spread out your sources. And that's plausible because a lot of these, and this is a focus really I should have said on automotive components, but we did the same exercise for electronics and apparel, that it is costly to diversify and there is a trade-off. But what you tend to do is move away from excessive dependence on any particular source. And where do you go? You went, interestingly, often to other developing countries which had a revealed comparative advantage in this area, and not so much towards industrial countries. It's also relevant that you did not go to countries like India, which didn't have the kind of climate, even though India had seen a remarkable increase in its share of automotive components exports, it didn't really benefit as much as other countries like Thailand. Now, the first lesson I draw from this is that often in response to big shocks, and I'm acutely aware that COVID-19 is a very different shock, that there is a tendency to reduce dependence. And nowhere is there greater dependence today than on China. So the first, conjecture is, and it matches the interviews, the conversations, the policy statements where countries like Japan and the United Kingdom are providing incentives to their firms to shift away, arguably because firms themselves are not internalizing the welfare consequences, the public good interest in greater diversification, but that does in principle accelerate the trend that we already saw because of demographic changes in China, real wage increases in China, of production being moved away to countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Bangladesh. Now, of course, to take advantage of these opportunities, these countries have to implement reforms. For example, a country like Indonesia has inhibited its own participation in global value chains and trade by imposing restrictions on imports, by very inefficient domestic logistics. And in that respect, a country like India is very similar, where domestic logistics costs are twice as high as those in Bangladesh, for example, and 3 times as high as in China, and there is a constant flirtation with self-sufficiency, not recognizing that an effort to try and do everything yourself means that you end up doing nothing particularly well. So there is an opportunity which domestic reform might help you to take advantage of. The second big trend people are worried about is automation. Now, here's certain research that was done for the World Development Report last year shows that, ironically, that automation per se is not necessarily leading to a decline in imports from developing countries. In fact, some of the sectors like car production, which have seen the fastest growth in automation, have also seen the fastest growth in imports from developing countries. So again, reshoring through automation at this stage, it's not a judgment for all time, but at this stage doesn't seem to be a big threat. Instead, there is an opportunity emerging from the increasing digitization of services. Now, already services growth benefited enormously from the fact that previously non-tradable services became tradable through the revolutionary developments in information and communication technology, thanks to which countries like the Philippines and India were able to export back office services, IT services, business services, which were previously only tradable through the heavily restricted movement of people. Now, the interesting thing is some work we did looking at the importance of border effects in services, and this predated the crisis, revealed that services like finance, insurance, research and development tended to be traded within countries more than internationally, as opposed to tourism and other services. Now, the interesting development here is, of course, that COVID-19, by hurting face-to-face transactions, is making travel even more a problem. But firms and people are investing in digital equipment and literacy. The interesting thing to notice is that while much of this seems obvious, there is one subtle fact that when you could do what you preferred, which is buy services, let's say health and education, locally face to face, that was the preferred mode. But when that's not possible and you start buying those services digitally, that's a great leveling. The relative cost of international trade declines dramatically. And therefore, there's no particular reason to buy from the proximate supplier. And since these investments and this learning are here to stay, there's sunk costs. Therefore, this is likely to lead to a durable change in the pattern of services globalization. Just as hotels and others will take time to recover because of bankruptcies leading to exit, new types of services will see almost certainly a faster growth. And when you look at already during the COVID crisis, there is this difference that transport and travel, this is January, this is February, and this is March. You see big drops in travel services, but growth in these potentially digitally tradable services like finance, business services, and telecommunications. I've just looked at the data that's been released for the month of May or April, and these developments persist. And this is true also for the United States. So this tendency, I argue, is going to create an opportunity for other countries like Malaysia, China, Philippines, and India, who are already well placed, but in order to take full advantage of these opportunities, you need greater skills, greater investment in, for example, the skill production function, the quality of universities, and digital networks. The two trends that are the positive are face this countervailing protectionist trend. Already there were divisions, but this insecurity prompted by the crisis has led to export restrictions, and those export restrictions are breeding even greater craving, as I said, for self-sufficiency, because trade no longer seems a reliable way of securing supplies in bad states. There's another trend which is worrying, which is Because, first of all, recovery is not going to be synchronized. East Asia, for example, is recovering much faster than other parts of the world. Now, when you need imports, that's a blessing. But when your own firms are struggling to recover, it might seem like a curse, especially in a world where every country has used a lot of assistance for its firms to help them to survive. That could create a huge new wave of what is referred to in trading system as countervailing duties. Now, that protectionism is, I think, one of the biggest risks to recovery. And Cesar, could you tell me how many minutes I have, which will help me to make a choice between either venturing into a 5-minute or a 1-minute conclusion? I hope you can all hear
Sorry,
me.
Aaditya. Sorry, I had my mic muted. Yeah, just yeah, complete your presentation. Yeah, don't rush.
No, what I was going to say, quickly or in 5 minutes?
Take the 5 minutes and do it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll do it even faster. So anyway, the bottom line I want to make is that we are in an era where this changing relative dominance of the United States and the ascendance of China is creating a deep tension. We are also where the political economy of trade has been turned on its head by greater sensitivity of populists to the interests of workers and to the interests of consumers. This chart is one of my favorite charts, which shows the light gray line, the long-term share for the last 200 years in the share of the United Kingdom in global trade. This dark line shows the share of the United States, and the blue, the share of China. Now, those of you who have a long memory or an interest in history will remember that, one episode, the Opium Wars, the horrors of the Opium Wars obscure the fact that when the British induced the Chinese to open up their ports to trade, they did not ask for exclusive access. They asked for opening up vis-a-vis the whole world. This was the era of confident, dominant Britain ushering in the Pax Britannica and becoming a pillar of a non-discriminatory trading system. The first wobble came in the 1890s when the Germans and Americans threatened to catch up, and the capitulation when its share, which had hovered around 20% of world trade through much of the 19th century, fell below 10%. That's when imperial preferences came in, and that was when the Great Depression, protectionism. Now, when you look at the United States, the post-war era, the US share was more than 20%. The US confident chose non-discrimination, Pax Americana rule, until they began to panic when there was a threat of Japan catching up, voluntary export restraints were brought in, and the final capitulation, I think, predated the current administration. It was when the Obama regime, very soon after having the US having ushered in China into the non-discriminatory system, started negotiating the TPP. The point of this chart is that these long-term hegemonic transitions can be super disruptive, as was the case in the years between the war. And that is a fundamental tension in the system. Why does it happen? Instead of inflicting complex analytics on you, let me just say that a strong dominant hegemon needs to commit to rules to ensure the participation of other countries. When relative dominance declines, it is as if you no longer, you need to play by the rules because there is greater symmetry. Today, we are witnessing what I would call a latecomer problem. China, other countries have grown in size. There's symmetry in size, but asymmetry in protection. And also there is recourse to instruments like subsidies, state enterprises, which are creating, at least within certain domains, a big asymmetry in openness. So the first necessity, and I think it's in nobody's interest more than in China's, and this is work that I've done with Bob Steger, which is less complicated than it seems, which suggests that eventually it's in everybody's interest to ensure that a rule-based system arises, and therefore for the rising hegemon to make the kind of deeper concessions to ensure its persistence. Now, whether that bargain can happen and whether that enlightenment is possible is the first challenge. The second challenge, I would say, is, as I said, the changing domestic political economy, the growing inequality, which is reasonably attributed to globalization and to the failure of domestic policies. But the economists' argument that you should deal with inequality through domestic instruments fails on the ground when globalization also makes it hard to tax. The mobility of capital and skilled labor has meant a race to the bottom in taxes, as this picture shows. And unless you can cooperate meaningfully, as you alluded to digital taxation and other things, the new inequalities and the newly indebted states that will emerge from COVID will be tempted to protect. And finally, there are new insecurities about data flows and others, and those are also long-lived. They predated the crisis, but there are important ways in which they could be addressed through international cooperation, like the Privacy Shield Agreement and like the TPP agreement, which tried to strike a bargain between protecting consumer interests and returns for openness. My general point is that we do need imaginative cooperation, which will deal with these concerns which have been accentuated post-COVID, whether it's to deal with production subsidies, state enterprises, the whole paranoia about labor mobility, but also issues in financial services and competition policy, especially as large firms are tempted to take over small firms, and there is a concern about who's going to appropriate the benefits of openness. Thank you very much, Cecil, for your generosity. I hope I wasn't too long-winded. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aaditya, for that grand overview of the status of the world in trade at the moment, and also giving us a historical perspective. I'll ask Mia now to make her presentation. Mia?
So, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to join Aaditya and Craig and putting me in this eminent category of people, which I don't think I deserve, but I think the topic that you gave us to ponder on is extremely timely and relevant, and I thank Aaditya to for putting in such a great presentation. So I'm going to follow up more from the perspective of how all of these issues are perceived by Asia Pacific countries that we deal with. Now, obviously, ESCAP membership is very large. We cover countries from Turkey to Pacific Islands, from Russian Federation to New Zealand. But the core of the countries that are really involved in this sit still in East and Southeast Asia. And when we did the analysis of the participation of Asia Pacific countries in global value chains some years back, it was about 10 countries that are really involved. And as Aaditya also said, some of the countries that strive to be more participatory in global economy, like big economy like India, has some difficulties in really crossing that critical point. But let me just go through the points that I would like to make. And obviously, just to set the reasons why this crisis is being labeled as one of a kind, and look into the issues of the use of trade policy to deal with the recessions. And then, of course, I will move towards the looking at the global value chains and the losses of trade that are imminent or have already happened for Asia Pacific countries in this particular crisis. and how we can then deal with these. Obviously, the preference in what the UN system is calling building back better, and that Aaditya also hinted towards, is building something that will have a new social contract that will allow for countries' interdependence, but with lesser inequalities, and obviously with much better solution or options for the environment. So whether this is possible to do under the prism of the trade policies as we had them in the past is it remains the question. And I think what our take is from both theory and policies and reactions of the business sector is that this is like a spoiler alert, and the bottom line of what I want to say is that we will not see the end of globalization once we get out of this COVID with respect to having vaccine, etc. But we definitely will see a realignment that will change the not only geographical structure or composition of countries, but also sectoral ones. And that, of course, depends on or is driven by, as Aaditya said, by the urge to reduce the dependence on China, which is not really possible in a short run, maybe, and that's why we are seeing this realignment as China +1, and this one typically is still in developing country, unless we see the really strong use of digital in frontier technologies that would then allow really a part of the production and other activities along the value chain to be moved to the industrialized countries. Next slide, please. So just to repeat very briefly the reasons why we are talking about this crisis as being one in a century, and hopefully it will be in the early part of 21st century, so hopefully it's not going to be repeated that often. But apart from really having a drop in GDP and trade, employment, of course, is the one of the big harms that this crisis is bringing. And why is this happening? Because the crisis came on the tail of longer period of uncertainty. Now, of course, it started in 2008, but then it was deepened through the trade war. And already shaken global economy was then hit by the triple shocks. It started with the health crisis and the realization that the only measure that governments can actually take to spread the human-to-human transmission of the crisis was to keep people locked in. So the great lockdown then, of course, was accompanied by both supply and demand shocks. Supply shocks because the production simply ceased to be done first from China, and then it moved in a sort of very good, nice sequence following the virus as well. And as the inputs stopped being produced in one part of the value chain, then of course they were pushed down through this contagion effect into other parts of the supply chain. And then because people, of course, did not engage in productive activity, the demand started to collapse. And while many governments very quickly, surprisingly, came up with helping helping workers get some income, because of the uncertainty in terms of the duration of the crisis. We really don't see this demand coming up in a big way. And I think the recovery will also mostly depend on how quickly the demand will come up. The impact on jobs was really bad, and ILO has estimated so far the loss in the first quarter to the tune of 130 million jobs, but the estimates go much higher. And the tragedy really is that it is, of course, again hitting those that are always vulnerable, which is informal workers, women, the sectors that are labor intensive, low skilled, and in the smaller economies that already have difficulties in going through certain other crises that they're exposed to, typically environmental or natural disasters. What is also different in this crisis is that the services are hit quite starkly. And of course, we are talking about traditional services that depend on proximity of consumer and provider. Tourism, travel, hospitality, accommodation, entertainment in one kind, in terms of restaurants, etc. But then on the other hand, we have services that are able to use digital technologies to remain not only remain in business, but actually to boom through this crisis. So this is what crisis is about. I think obviously it's not felt in the same way in all the countries, but typically all of these we find in most of the countries. On what I didn't put on a slide, but I would like to actually mention two other losses that we are very much worried about. One is, of course, the loss of educational opportunities for many kids that do not have access to online learning in developing countries, which can then very much translate into the employment opportunity. So it is on the side of the human capital loss that we expect. On the other side of the losses also, because many of the small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as some large ones, are actually collapsing because they have no preparation plans, reserves, etc. There will be loss of entrepreneurship capacity as well. So while of course we are aware of the Schumpeterian constructive destruction, there is also this other threat that we will lose part of the capacity through the bankruptcies and closure of the business sector that in some countries will be very difficult to replace. And then this is relevant for opening again of the supply chains, because if these particular nodes cannot be replaced quickly, then of course that will also drive the realignment of the value chain in a different way. Okay, so let me now turn next slide, please, to what is happening with the use of trade policy in the context of crisis. And so I'm using, of course, data from Simon Evenett Global Trade Alert that he regularly puts out in terms of the use of trade measures, both on the liberalizing and distortive or restricting side. And I'm aware that there is this now new project with the World Bank and Bernard Heckman that specifically looks at the sector of medical products and food sector as well, because they came up through the crisis as ones where countries are more sensitive in terms of allowing free transactions across the border. So what Simon recently did, he actually compared the composition of trade measures in the last big crisis that we had, which is 2008 global financial crisis, and in this COVID situation. So what you have on the slide, the first two bars actually show the composition of the trade measures that are used. And I don't know if you can see the legend, but of course it starts with the import tariffs, and then it goes into the other standard behavior of the governments where they want to restrict import and boost export. So you have the black is import tariffs, the blue is export incentives, and then the brown is really the subsidies to the import competing firms. So you can see that about 60% in the previous crisis was really sitting in the area of we would call it like a normal or mainstream interventionist policies on the trade side of the governments. When you look at the very last bar for 2020, you can see these traditional areas reduced, except for the subsidies to the import competing firms, but you have one area which is really prominently now shown, which is red one, and these are export limits, and of course this is not the traditional way of intervening, because unless you want to do it for the purpose of controlling the world market and getting a better price through that. And sometimes, as we saw in the food crisis in a few, I think a decade back, with when the prices were much higher in many countries for rice and other staple foods, and then the countries had to restrict export to ensure sufficient domestic supply. So the motivation for export restriction here that happened mostly in the medical products that are needed for the health workers to cope with the COVID, and in fewer cases with food items, were really at play in this particular case. Next slide, please. What also is now very noticeable is that when we have a crisis and when we have a reaction of governments on both import and export side, basically this is an additive process, and so it's a building up of the protection that stays in. So what we are, for example, in the latest report from the WTO released, I think yesterday or the day before, about 10% of the G20 imports is using the protection that was put in the global financial crisis. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the Asia, next slide, please. So when it comes to the Asia Pacific, what we see is that the countries in Asia Pacific from January to May were reacting in the same way as global average. So they were applying export restrictions, and then when realizing that maybe this is not the best policy to get the essential goods. The counter sort of implementation of measures of trade facilitation and putting in place the measures that provide smoother access to necessary and essential goods started to happen, which is visible here in May. So next slide. So let me now very quickly, I know that time is very short, very quickly look into the global value chains in Asia. So, you know, we all know that the expansion of global value chains that happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s, etc., happened under the environment of course, technological possibilities to fragment the production, but also falling transport costs, falling ICT costs, falling tariffs because of the multilateral and regional and unilateral liberalization, but also because the investors and the traders had this insurance of having a stable and predictable trade rules in the context of the WTO. So that allowed them really to span into the value chains on the efficiency model and just-in-time model without really looking much into the risk involved and the need to diversify, etc. So when we had the crisis in 2008, what happened is that because of some interruptions that were happening in the context of the globalization and the costs related to getting the finance, etc., we do have this leveling off of the rise of the global value chains, but we do not see the reversals, right? So the trade continued to grow through these channels, and as Aaditya said also, the instances of great disruptions to the value chains, like tsunami he mentioned and the flooding in Thailand, did not really cause much reversal. They did cause certain shortening of some of the value chains, but definitely not return of those into the industrial countries. So the next slide, please. The biggest loser based on ITC analysis on the loss of trade that we see is for the Asian countries, it is about $71 billion. And then, of course, this is shared from pretty much equally from their interdependence with the Europe, factory of Europe, factory of Asia through China, and factory of North Asia. Next slide, please. What I want to show in this one is, and I'm really sorry, I don't think you can read all the labels, but just to show the extent of the backward and forward linkages through in our subregions in Asia Pacific. And so in Southeast Asia, we have 43% of export linked in some way to the value chain. So the importance or relevance of this is their ability to recover will also depend very much on whether these value chains will be put in place sooner rather than later after the recovery. I have next slide, please, where we look at some of the ASEAN countries and the linkage in particular to China, because as already said, the concentration in this interdependence to China is perhaps the most sensitive, and so we can see that both in case of Vietnam, which is more which is dependent on China, but in a more diversified way than for example, Cambodia, we have then calculated that turns out into rather significant loss of export capacity of these two countries. Next slide. So I have another one slide only. So when we are talking about the recovery from the crisis and the building back better, we are talking about looking at using all the stimulus packages and ability to borrow through, you know, a relaxed monetary policy, etc., to really align them with the sustainable development goals, in case, you know, wherever possible, to really look into new investment that will allow decarbonization, and then also to nudge improvement in social protection programs and initiatives, as well as it has been shown here, the importance of having universal health cover, but also maybe starting the discussion about the basic income, which is of course politically sensitive question. Now, when it comes to building back of the supply chain, what has been really remarkable in this crisis is the lack, absenteeism of cooperation between countries. It took almost 2 months for G20 to make any sensible statement on the protection on trade and the need for cooperation, or to come, you know, to the same table when looking at trade policies. And about the, I think a little bit less time, but for the biggest of the regional blocks, or deepest of the regional blocks like ASEAN, to start actually very actively look into how to address these questions. So next slide, please. So what we are working with our members is really try to put all stakeholders into the same room and trying to have discussions and consultations in terms of you know, helping their capacity to look into the recovery models or recovery packages for the sectors or the countries. So what is obvious is really that a new business model will have to be looked in, where much more emphasis will be put on internalization of risks rather than only focusing on just-in-time models. That we will have to really look at the government intention to enable these new business models by their incentives. So some of the incentives have been very openly linked to just cause the realignment away from China, which is not a good motivation, nor it's a stable one to allow businesses to operate. So we are working to really change that picture, and then of course also focusing on how to enable digitalization and use of digital technologies in both private and government sector. Let me stop here because I have used all the credits that of kindness of Cecira, and thank him for allowing me to go as long as I had. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mia. Yes, we are running a bit out of time. So without further ado, I will ask Craig to come on. Craig, please.
Thank you, Cecira. The rules-based international trading system is facing its biggest crisis since it was formed by 23 countries after the Second World War. And it was already facing that before the coronavirus epidemic struck. We should ask why the general agreement on tariffs and trade did come to pass in 1948 amongst 23 countries. And the answer is that its architects had learned the lessons of the Second World War and indeed the First World War. And that is, it was better to trade with other countries rather than to invade other countries. So the basic rationale for the creation of the rules-based system after the Second World War was to avoid a Third World War. It went pretty well for a long time. From 1948 onwards, there are various rounds of liberalisation, of reducing trade barriers, all the way through to the Uruguay round, which completed in 1994. And so things were looking good because more and more countries joined this agreement. And in 1995, it became what it is today, the World Trade Organization. Other milestones on the road to liberalisation were the launching of the Doha round in the year 2000 and the entry of China into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And China was started opening up in 1978, but things were really accelerating, and it was really important to have China come in. We may discuss the issue of China's developing country status later in questions and answers, but I'll just park that as one of the issues that has been revived more recently, most particularly by the United States. But then liberalisation started to slow down. There might be various reasons for this, but perhaps it was a mistake to launch the Doha round in 2000 and in the year 2000. The reason I say that is probably a level of exhaustion of all of the negotiations that had gone for the Uruguay round and the rounds before it. And it was an incredibly ambitious round. It basically was everything that you could think of became the Doha Development Agenda. I was Trade Minister from 2010 to 2013, and when I was appointed to that position and travelled to meet my colleagues, essentially trying to get that Doha round moving, I found a lot of inertia. And so I'd suggested that we break the round up because it was just so massive. And there was a basic principle that nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. I don't know how many times I heard that. Craig, nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. And everything was on the table, so nothing was ever going to be agreed. So I suggested we break the round up into various components and work on those rather than try to do everything at once. That had some success in the fact that the trade facilitation agreement, which was estimated to be worth more than 40% of the total value of the Doha round, was reached in 2014. Someone reflected recently, though, that that's the only substantive agreement that has been reached by the World Trade Organization in 25 years. Since that time, there have been very disturbing developments. The election of President Trump has put into reverse the belief and support for trade liberalisation. President Trump had declared very early that trade wars are good and easy to win, and he started one with China. And that involved putting a lot of tariffs on Chinese goods, but the Americans didn't limit it to China. In fact, they put tariffs on goods from the European Union and other countries around the world. And again, disturbingly, in order to justify that, they invoked a national security clause that was in the original General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And it was really put there, not as an afterthought, but as something that people would hope would never be needed. And that is, the architects of the GATT had said, well, what if our national security is threatened? Maybe we would need temporarily to put tariffs on steel and other vital inputs. And so that clause was put in, but was never activated, and no one really thought that much about it until the last few years. I noted that the US has put tariffs on Whirlpool washing machines, and I hope that's not because they want to keep their troops, you know, in great shape with very clean clothes. But the point I'm making is that it was a spurious provision to invoke in arguing that US tariffs were in fact in accordance with the WTO or the GATT before that. They weren't. They were a violation of that. They may have had their reasons in relation to China's expansion and state-owned enterprises and subsidies and so on, but there's no doubt that the Americans did breach the World Trade Organization rules. The next big step in all of this was the destruction of the appellate body and the appeals process. We have panels in the WTO, which here disputes that an allegation from one country that another is violating agreements. Those panel decisions could be final, but very often they're appealed to a higher court, if you like, called the appellate body. That had 7 judges on it. Their terms expire after 2 lots of 4 years. And as they were expiring, the US was vetoing any further appointments. It got down to just 3 judges, which is the minimum number, who can hear an appeal, and then 2, and then 1, and now the appellate body does not work at all. Out of a bit of desperation, a group of countries have set up an alternative body outside the WTO, but that can't, of course, deal with American grievances or grievances against America. So we got to that point before the coronavirus had hit, and since that time, there's been a lot of talk about strategic industries and so on. And I tend to agree with Aaditya. There'll be a lot of discussion about that. There'll be a lot of governments talking about the need for self-reliance in these industries. But in the end, if they can't compete, the government would have to step in and basically provide large subsidies or re-erect tariff barriers, which again would be in violation of the WTO rules in most cases. So I think that's one of the kind of new pressures that the COVID crisis has put on a system that was already under enormous pressure. I'm a bit of an optimist. You have to keep working on ways to keep the WTO alive, and there's no prospect of any real progress at the global level in terms of all 164 countries agreeing to anything, in my view. The US doesn't want to, China doesn't want to remove some of its state subsidies, and so we're probably at an impasse. But on my optimistic note, there has been a reasonable amount of talk about open plurilateral agreements, and I think that is the way forward, while we're wishing and hoping and praying that some of the major countries member countries will come to their senses. The value of an open plurilateral agreement is that it's non-discriminatory. It doesn't need all countries, all 164 countries to be involved. I'm advised that there are actually negotiations going on for a couple of open plurilateral agreements. And the idea is that a subset of the 164 members come together. They start negotiations, but it's on what's called a most favoured nation basis. That is, it's not closed just to those members. The provisions would be available to those countries that are not in those negotiations. There is a provision for this in the WTO rules, and indeed there have been 2 or 3 agreements that have actually been plurilateral agreements. So Cicero, I think that probably is the way forward at this stage. It doesn't mean that we've saved the WTO, but we've kept it alive at least, and looking and hoping for better days and for a realisation that we are globally interdependent, that the global trading system has generated enormous amount of prosperity, not only in rich countries, but especially in poorer countries. And it would be a terrible tragedy and almost a willful effort to forget the lessons of World War II. We're in a trade war environment now. The last thing I'll say is this: it has now evolved into a technology war. between China and the United States. My fear is that countries like Australia are going to have to choose between a technology system or spine or structure of the United States or one of China, but not both. Because there are increasing national security issues around this technology war. In fact, I think that's, you know, a very large part of what's driving them. From our Australian point of view, we would think that we have and we do, have a closer economic, commercial, trading relationship with China than we do with the United States, but then we have a closer strategic relationship with the United States than we do with China. So if this choice is imposed at some time in the future, it'll be a very, very difficult one for Australia to make. So sorry to end on that rather down note. I think there's enough that we can do to keep going, to keep paddling underwater, to keep the body alive, and wish and hope for better days, and maybe for a United States that does actually remember that it too has prospered from the open trading system from which we all have gained. Thanks, Cicero.
Thanks very much, Craig. Even for an optimist to end on that note suggests that for non-optimistic realists, it might be even darker, the prospects, the way they look. Thanks very much to all the panelists. We have both had technical glitches, people accessing, including our panelists, and we are quite tight for time. So we'll open up for questions to the panel. There are a couple that have come up already, and I have got some others as well. I might summarize the two questions that have come up. Both relate to, you know, trade policy responses. What are the possibilities? And the questions are that, you know, whether there would be a shift away from multilateralism and towards regionalism dominated by regional trade agreements. And there's a specific question related to that, whether the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, might be a platform for a new center of economic growth and for regional resilient supply chain platforms. I'll throw it open to all the panelists now, and we'll take them as they go. Yeah. Anyone who wants to go first? Craig?
Well, I'm supposed to be a fan of regional trade agreements because everyone tells me I should be, but I'm not. I think that they're a bit of an easy way out. You know, trade is global, and that, I'm not saying that they are of no value at all, but you know, we've had the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was really kicked along by the United States, and then the United States dropped out of it. We've got the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, in which India was a player, and it dropped out. So we've got Australia is in one regional agreement with what was the US group, and that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership -1. And we're in another regional agreement, which is Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership -1. I just don't think they're the solution. They might be better than nothing. And I wouldn't, certainly I was involved when we actually initiated, you know, we were at a meeting in Cambodia, kicking off the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But, you know, it seems to me that if the whole world trading system is too hard, having a regional trading system doesn't really make it all that much easier.
Thanks, Craig. Would Aaditya or Mia want to come in on that?
Mia's muted.
Sure, Mia, would you like to go ahead?
Right now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Just very briefly, I agree with Craig about, perhaps all people having too much expectation on the regional front to keep trade going. But I do have rather positive opinion on open plurilateral in terms of sectoral agreements, and because they can deepen actually the agreement of like-minded countries, and what we have seen successes of in the WTO era are really these sectoral agreements with information technology and then trade facilitation, etc., where you really can pull together the countries that agree on certain rules and the extent of these rules, and allow different type of countries to go along. The problem with using that as a complete blockage to the dissolution of WTO is that we have all this, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, which we can't get rid of, and I think it's a catch-22. I don't think that any benefit will come with putting two large regional blocks around China and around US, and that may actually lead to a bigger problem than it is a solution. So thank you, Cecilia.
Thanks, Mia. Aaditya, would you have a reaction to that?
Thank you. I tend to agree with my panelists. I just want to make 3 points. One is that a lot of new regional agreements are deep trade agreements. They venture beyond tariffs and simple protection to cover services, investment, competition policy. And we're about to put out a database on deep trade agreements in World Bank, which we've just put together. One interesting fact that emerges is that these deep trade agreements not only are much more trade creating than shallow trade agreements, but they are also often non-discriminatory. They have a public good aspect, that these provisions, when you have disciplines on competition policy, or you improve customs, or you make your regime more transparent, it's a benefit for all trading partners. It's not a preferential agreement. So de facto, it ends up being open regionalism. So that's one positive dimension. But there is a bigger negative concern where it comes to regulatory cooperation, for example, in data flows or professional qualifications. I think these, plus the risk of an infrastructural segmentation, which could arise for example, in the 5G technology, of Huawei technology not being accepted in some countries but in another. I think this is a far riskier, deeper segmentation of trade, which could pose real problems and really divide the world into blocks, because this is the infrastructure along which data flows and trade flows. And the final point I'd like to make is that the China-US agreement is in a way one of the most perverse bilateral preferential trade agreements, where in a way you have these explicit quantitative commitments to buy more, which are really not in China's interest and not in the interest of any third country. My hope is that China will show its commitment to the multilateral order by multilateralizing that agreement, seeing that not as an opportunity to buy off the US by giving them privileged access to the Chinese market, but see it instead as accession 2.0, where they accelerate reform broadly, which is in their interest and which would not hurt third countries. Now, that is the kind of perhaps leadership I would hope that China would play, in the role it would play in the future. Thank you.
Craig, do you want to react to that in any way?
No, I agree, but can I just be a bit of a naughty boy and say, hi, Mia. I worked at ESCAP, and that's probably your building in the late 1970s, so I have very, very as an economist.
Okay. Very good, very good. Glad to hear that. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
yeah, actually, if I could use my this chance to come back to this issue that Craig raised, and Aaditya also touched on, particularly with the technology issue, where technology has become so important and has become a security issue. And whether it is entirely security related or not, it has been certainly conveyed as such. So we have got into a situation with China, beginning with the the whole telecommunication thing, but extending further, whether the costs of this kind of quote unquote securitization of trade policy is going to, what are the economic costs of this? These don't seem to be really brought out in the public debates in Australia. As an observer, we see the process. There's continuous reports in newspapers. There have been police, security agencies have raided parliamentary MPs for having relationships. We don't know the full extent or the reason for this, but there's a whole atmosphere that is being created where relationships with China and relationships with China become relationships with the Communist Party, because of course we know that it's a one-party state, and almost anyone who is in a position of influence or power, including people in industry, would have some relationship to the Communist Party. So we have a situation where trade issues are getting so closely linked to security issues that whether we are going to be going down the path of the 1930s, where trade and security became one and ended up with a global, with the Second World War. I know this is a difficult question to answer, but I would like to hear from the panelists whether, how do you look at this evolving?
Well, we may have already seen inadvertently through answering the last question, the beginnings of two rival trading blocs through RCEP, which doesn't include the US, but does include China, and then through the TPP, which did include the US, but never included China. Whether they become the vehicle for rival trading blocs is not that important. We're saying that there's enough dynamics for those two groupings to have been created. Now, what does this mean for the future? As this technology problem deepens, the impetus to requiring countries to make a choice, I think, is going to get greater. And so you'll get a lot of countries, perhaps those typified who are deeply involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, saying, well, we're really integrated with China, so we will go that way for economic reasons, and other countries will go with the United States, and Australia will be torn between the two because China is the dominant commercial relationship and the United States is the dominant strategic relationship. So there may be other countries in a situation like ours, but potentially it's a very difficult one for Australia. Somehow we need the leadership of both China and the United States to pull back and have a look at how their security interests can be preserved. No one would suggest to either of them that they shouldn't have that as an objective, but in a way that does not create rival trading blocs.
Any other reactions? Aaditya? Oh, yeah, no. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
One idea, sorry, just one quick point I wanted to make was, I think there is a real challenge of how we can have openness when there are legitimate concerns about firms being too close to certain states. And I think somehow we have to draw inspiration from other agreements where you have commitments by the home country, the investing country, the origin country, that it has an arm's length relationship, that the company will operate purely on commercial grounds, for example, the rules on state trading enterprises in the WTO, and will be not in any way influenced. Now, how you can make this credible and in a way justiciable is a big challenge, but it's that kind of commitment which we need, which can somehow be subject to independent verification, that in a way the trade deal would be that the exporting country or the home country becomes a guarantor of the arm's length, non-dubious behavior of an entity in return for seeking market access to other countries. I think that kind of deal, whether we can think about, I think that's what's relevant increasingly, whether we're thinking of, for example, privacy concerns on data flows or food standards.
The problem there, I think, Aaditya, is that China, only 2 or 3 years ago passed a national law, which essentially said not only state-owned enterprises, but all enterprises shall do what the government of China requires it to do in terms of national security. So, they might enter an agreement saying the national law doesn't apply in this case, but it will, because those enterprises can't survive in China without the support of the state, whether they're state-owned enterprises or private enterprises.
I think that is, for me, if I can just say one thing, and it's a question for all of us. Why China at this juncture, when it has so much to gain from openness? It's become a big investor abroad. It has a stake in openness of markets. Why, in a way, this premature nationalism or premature recourse to a law like the one you're referring to, which is somehow antithetical to the openness it wants to secure in foreign markets? I think this is a big puzzle for me, that at this juncture, China has had another 10, 15 years of huge growth potential, but somehow even the China 2025, with its heavy emphasis on aggressive strategic support for certain industries, I think it seems to have prematurely provoked a backlash in a way that mystifies me.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if you look at China since its opening, there's some agricultural reform, but then labour-intensive manufacturing was the big thing, and then heavy industry was the next big thing, then spreading of consumer spending, but now we're really in this digital age, and I'm no expert on this, but China does seem to be doing very well and investing an enormous amount into artificial intelligence, and it's not an adopter. I mean, I'm sure it does adopt American and other technologies where it can, but it's going to be increasingly a creator of those technologies, and so that'll be the next big happening thing for the Chinese economy, and maybe that's what they're thinking about. Maybe they're thinking past some opportunities, as you say, to increase prosperity in the next decade or two, to the extent that it's still available for them to do that. But they're saying, well, to use an old phrase, we're going to take a great leap forward into this digital age, and we won't be, playing second fiddle to the United States or anyone else. We're going to be creating our own future.
Yeah, if I just may come in with a couple of sentences in that, I think the major problem is really the both countries, US and China, are looking at tit for tat and decoupling problem, right? China has tried actually to substitute this with opening to other countries. And if you see the tariffs and the other policies that have been put in place with respect to other industrial countries, but also mostly developing countries, it is really opening its market considerably for those countries, right? While US is not really doing that, right? So what we are seeing really is that China is trying to actually become more attractive market for the developing countries themselves, not only through investment but also opening the markets for them. The problem is really how to put together US and China to start talking in a more constructive way, rather than just retaliatory way.
And I think I'll just briefly say this. It's easy. You probably got the impression that I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump. I don't know. But it is also a reflection of where America is at the moment. We travelled through a significant part of the United States a couple of years ago, and the Rust Belt is real. It had a huge manufacturing sector, and there's just hectares of empty factories and weeds growing and rust and all of that. And politically, it's appealing for a presidential candidate to say, I will get those jobs back. China took those jobs from us and we'll get them back. Well, they've actually left China now. They're in Bangladesh and places like that, and they're being automated. They're not coming back. But politically, it's a really appealing proposition to people who haven't been to university, who believe that they could just leave school early and work in a factory and get a pickup truck and have some fun. And that really is pretty much the story of the 2016 presidential election, with those Democrat states flipping to the Republicans. And the Democrats in the coming election will not be able to say, what do we want? Free trade. When do we want it now? That in order to get those states back, they will be engaged in what are essentially protectionist sentiments. I think that they won't be, if they are elected, if Biden is elected, he won't be like Trump, but he'll be a bit like Trump. He won't be Trump, but he'll be a bit like Trump. So it will be hard for any new president to have the sort of discussion, Mayor, that you're talking about, because it will not be popular at home.
Actually, we are, thanks, Craig. We are already out of time, but I might just throw one more question related to all this that has come up, which is the idea that the RCEP countries have done rather well just with the COVID crisis itself. They have controlled COVID better than the US or many countries in Western Europe. And India has dropped out, but that is again a country which is grappling with COVID-19 in a way that most countries in the ASEAN and this region, North Asia, have somehow done, at least at this point, seem to have done better. Whether the fact that RCEP members have done generally better than the rest of the world in controlling COVID-19 would somehow facilitate it to play a bigger role in the post-COVID-19 or even maybe ongoing COVID-19 era as a center for, as a pole for economic growth and cooperation. Is that, how do you react to that?
Well, that's probably true. And not everything, we shouldn't think all trade is hostage to a trade barrier. I mean, it'll be natural for those countries to trade. And even if there are some tariffs, they'll probably jump over those tariffs. You know? So I want to finish on a somewhat optimistic note, and that is obviously everyone, you know, in this discussion is for lower trade barriers, not higher. But it doesn't mean you can't generate prosperity even with the trade barriers that exist now, and even the investment barriers. So I tend to agree with you, Cicera. The countries that have got some dynamism in them will continue to have that. I just think we could do a lot better if we had a fully open trading system.
I just also want to add, Shashira, that because these countries are doing relatively better, touch wood, that will stay like that in terms of controlling COVID, they will be also able to really not only start production in manufacturing, but also in services and create these bubbles for tourism and business travel and education, etc., which is so lacking in terms of bringing back employment and SMEs, etc. Right? So I think that in reality can become a good growth hub and secure, you know, maybe even this conversion to the sustainable development much faster than the other countries. Thanks.
You're muted, Cicera.
Cicera, you need to unmute. Yeah.
Aaditya, would you like to come in on that? Any final comments?
He's muted too. There we go.
No, I think this is a very interesting idea, an extension of the trans-Tasman bubble to include also other Asian countries. And, you know, as I said, my one worry is that, you know, if this asynchronous recovery, that some countries recover earlier than others and are in a position to export might, and especially in a world where so much of this recovery now necessarily has involved state support for firms, I worry that it might provoke, you know, protectionism in other parts of the world once their hunger for masks and ventilators is satisfied and their own firms are trying to recover. So I think apart from the positive reasons for these early recoverers to forge a deeper economic relationship in goods and services, as Nick said, there might also be the very fact that other countries are less ready to open their markets and be open to them. So I think there might be a kind of self-fulfilling equilibrium in this deeper integration. And I think I see positive aspects, but I think as I remain like Craig, a die-hard multilateralist. So I would rather see a revival of multilateralism to the kind of broadening the scope of cooperation, as I said, to encompass areas. And I see that this idea of plurilateral agreements as harbingers of deeper participation, as happened in the Tokyo round, where you talked about subsidies, standards, and anti-dumping discipline. I think it could happen on data flows. It could happen on, it needs to happen on taxation. And but I'd rather it happened in Geneva than anywhere.
Not happening.
I think we all probably, I'm sure we all agree on that ideally we would like to see global opening up rather than partial opening up here and there and all these little bubbles, which would be not second best, third best, or fourth best perhaps. But at least it's good to see that not everyone is closing up and that there's still some momentum within the world to try to resist this seemingly strengthening tide towards 1930s type protectionism, trade wars, and hopefully, God forbid, armed conflicts that have followed this kind of development in the past. So I want to thank the three panelists on behalf of CDS. And I'm sure that this is going to be an evolving issue, and hopefully we would be able to continue this dialogue in future. And before I finish, I want to also just let everyone know that the next webinar in our series is on pathways to economic recovery from COVID-19. We have Kaushik Basu and Raghuram Rajan, the ex-chief economist IMF and ex-chief economist World Bank, and who are also both chief economic advisors to the Indian government at one stage. They would be talking on that on the 2nd of July at 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. And we hope that all of you and more will be able to attend and participate in that. And once again, I want to thank everyone, Craig, Aaditya, yeah, stay safe and stay well and keep fighting for free trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.